On this vote, the yeas are 222 and the nays are 200. The motion is adopted. The clerk will report the resolution.
Discharge calendar number 3, House Resolution 432. Resolved that immediately upon adoption of this resolution, the House shall proceed to the consideration in the House of the bill, H.R. 2550, to nullify the executive order relating to exclusions from federal labor management relations programs and for the purposes. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. The bill shall be considered as read. All points of order against provisions in the bill are waived. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the bill and on any amendment thereto to final passage without any intervening motion except 1 hour of debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform or their respective designees, and 2, 1 motion to
You just watched the institutional machinery of resistance spring to life, and what you're seeing in that procedural vote is nothing less than democracy's immune system, attempting to fight off an authoritarian infection, because when Trump signed an executive order ending collective bargaining for wide swaths of federal employees back in March, he wasn't just attacking workers, he was launching the single largest act of union busting in American history, and the House just fired back with a discharge petition that forces a vote on H.R. 2550, even as Republican leadership desperately tried to bury it in committee hell. This is the moment where the contradictions of neo-fascist capitalism become so glaring, so undeniable, that even a handful of Republicans had to break ranks because you cannot claim to be the party of working people while simultaneously stripping 1 million federal employees of their most basic workplace. Protections in the labor movement just proved something that should terrify every oligarch bankrolling this administration, which is that when you push workers into a corner, when you try to silence the nurses caring for our veterans, and the food inspectors keeping our families safe, and the scientists protecting us from pandemics, those workers will organize and they will fight back with every tool democracy gives them. Let me break down what just happened procedurally, because this matters, and it reveals the extraordinary lengths Democrats and a brave handful of Republicans had to go to overcome GOP obstruction. A discharge petition on the Protect America's Workforce Act reached 218 signatures, mandating the House of Representatives vote on restoring union rights to federal workers within 7 legislative days, and what that means is that Speaker Mike Johnson, who has been sitting on this legislation for months trying to protect Trump from having to either veto a bipartisan rebuke or watch his union-busting executive order get demolished by Congress, has now lost control of his own chamber. GOP Congressmen Nick LaLota and Mike Lawler signed the petition, bringing the total number of signatures to 218, and those 2 New York Republicans understood something that the rest of their conference is too captured by MAGA extremism to grasp, which is that when you attack federal workers, attack veterans because roughly 1/3 of federal union members served this country in uniform, and you attack every American who depends on a functioning government. The executive order itself includes employees whose jobs touch on national defense, border security, foreign relations, energy security, pandemic preparedness, the economy, public safety and cybersecurity, which is such a laughably broad definition of national security that it becomes clear this was never about protecting America. It was about punishing unions for standing up to Trump's illegal mass firings and his assault on the civil service, and even a federal judge saw through this transparent retaliation, finding that the executive order was unconstitutional. Retaliation meant to punish them for engaging in activity protected by the First Amendment, including vocal opposition and legal challenges to the administration. Think about the audacity of that legal finding for a moment, because what it means is that Trump looked at unions exercising their constitutional rights to sue his administration for breaking the law, and he responded by trying to destroy those unions entirely, which is textbook authoritarianism, straight out of the Project 2025 playbook that this administration swore up and down they knew nothing about even as they implement it page by page. And let's talk about Project 2025, because this executive order is straight out of Project 2025, according to AFL-CIO President Liz Schuler, and in just 2 months they have completed 1/3 of the 900-page Project 2025 agenda, which reveals that every denial, every claim of ignorance was a calculated lie, designed to get Trump back into power so he could wage class warfare on behalf of billionaires like Elon Musk, who can shred the services that working people depend on the federal government to do. This is about dismantling the administrative state, not because it's inefficient, but because it stands between corporate power and total domination, because when food safety inspectors have union protections, they can blow the whistle on contaminated products without fear of retaliation, and when EPA scientists have collective bargaining rights, they can resist political pressure to bury climate research, and when VA nurses can organize, they can demand safe staffing ratios that actually serve our veterans, instead of just padding hospital profit margins. The sheer scale of what Trump attempted should take your breath away because the Trump administration ended collective bargaining rights for 84.4% of the unionized federal workforce, or 1 out of every 14 workers nationwide covered by a union contract. And according to Georgetown labor historian Joseph McCartan, the March 27 order was by far the largest single action of union busting in American history. Let that sink in for a moment, because we're not talking about some incremental erosion of labor rights. We're talking about a frontal assault that dwarfs anything Reagan did to air traffic controllers, dwarfs anything Thatcher did to British miners, dwarfs anything we've seen in the modern history of industrialized democracies, and the White House had the gall to justify it by claiming that certain federal unions have declared war on President Trump's agenda, so as if exercising your legal right to challenge illegal executive actions constitutes an act of war, as if the real threat to national security isn't a president who fires competent civil servants and replaces them with loyalty test-passing extremists, but rather the unions trying to stop him. What makes this moment so galvanizing, so full of possibility, is that the labor movement did exactly what it needed to do, which is organize. The labor movement fought back against the largest act of union busting in American history by doing what we do best, organizing, said AFL-CIO President Liz Schuler, and that organizing built a bipartisan coalition that Speaker Johnson could not suppress, that Trump cannot veto without enormous political cost, and that demonstrates the enduring power of solidarity when workers and their allies refuse to accept authoritarian edicts as inevitable. Signatories to the discharge petition included nearly the entire Democratic caucus and 5 Republicans who co-sponsored the bill, which proves that even in our polarized hellscape, there are still pressure points where public opinion and constituent demands can overcome partisan tribalism and corporate capture. The human cost of Trump's union busting is already devastating, and it's going to get worse before this is over, because in August, the Department of Veterans Affairs notified union members that it was ending nearly all of its collective bargaining agreements, affecting hundreds of thousands of workers who care for America's veterans, and many workers fear with unions gone, they won't have a say in matters such as telework or family leave policies that make a difference to their quality of life. We're already seeing an exodus of talent from federal service as chemists, toxicologists, engineers, and other professionals decide that working for an administration that strips away your workplace protections while demanding absolute loyalty to a would-be autocrat simply isn't worth it. And when those experts leave, they take with them decades of institutional knowledge and expertise that cannot be replaced by political appointees whose primary qualification is their willingness to pledge fealty to Trump. Let's be absolutely clear about what collective bargaining means in the federal context, because unlike private sector unions, federal employees cannot bargain collectively over wages, benefits, or classifications, nor can they strike under existing law, which means their bargaining rights are already severely constrained, limited to basic conditions of employment. And Trump wanted to take away even that minuscule protection because he knows that workers who cannot organize collectively cannot effectively resist when management demands they participate in illegal activities or unethical practices. Collective bargaining rights are critical for union nurses, so we can advocate for our veterans and ensure they get the care they deserve, said Irma Westmoreland, a registered nurse, and when you strip those rights away, you're not making government more efficient, you're making it easier to provide substandard care and harder for workers to sound the alarm without sacrificing their livelihoods. The pattern here is unmistakable, and it connects to every other authoritarian move this administration has made. Because Trump fired a sitting member of the National Labor Relations Board in his first week back in office, rendering the agency unable to function, he's gutted USAID, he's launched mass firings of probationary employees, he's dismantled civil service protections that took decades to build, and every single one of these actions serves the same purpose, which is to consolidate power, eliminate independent centers of resistance, and transform the federal government from a public institution serving the common good into a patronage machine serving Trump and his billionaire backers. This is the logic of oligarchy, dressed up in the rhetoric of efficiency and national security, and what makes it so dangerous is that it's happening with the explicit support of the wealthiest man on the planet, who views government as nothing more than an obstacle to his own accumulation of wealth and power. The legal battle over this executive order has been a roller coaster that perfectly illustrates how our institutions are straining under authoritarian pressure because a federal judge granted a preliminary injunction after ruling that the Trump administration likely violated the law by stripping nearly 1 million federal government employees of their union rights. But then Jupiter Appeals Court lifted the June preliminary injunction, allowing agencies to proceed with enforcing Trump's executive order, and now agencies are terminating union contracts while litigation continues in what amounts to a race to inflict maximum damage before the courts can stop them. This is exactly the kind of bad faith governance that destroys the social contract, because even when courts rule against the administration, even when judges explicitly say you are breaking the law, Trump's people just keep steamrolling forward, calculating that by the time appellate courts issue final rulings, the damage will be irreversible, and unions will be too weakened to effectively reorganize. What you're seeing play out is a fundamental test of whether democratic institutions can constrain executive power, or whether we've entered an era where presidents can simply ignore judicial rulings and congressional oversight, if they're willing to be brazen enough about it. And the answer so far is terrifying, because Trump has demonstrated over and over that he will push every boundary break, every norm violate, every statute, until someone physically stops him, and even then he'll keep going, betting that his supporters and his court-captured judiciary will eventually ratify whatever power grab he's attempted. The fact that the Trump administration told agencies not to terminate collective bargaining agreements while litigation was pending, but then sent agencies updated guidance telling them they could go ahead with terminating most union contracts, is a perfect encapsulation of this strategy, which is to make promises to judges that buy time and then break those promises the moment you think you can get away with it. The workers affected by this aren't abstract bureaucrats. They're the people who keep America running, and the administration's own framing reveals how cynical this all is, because the executive order excludes agencies that have supported him, including those representing law enforcement and Customs and Border Protection employees, which means Trump isn't worried about national security, he's worried about political loyalty. If collective bargaining really threatened national security, then why do Border Patrol agents who are literally on the front lines of what Trump claims is an invasion still have their union rights, while the scientists at NOAA, who study hurricanes, and the nurses at VA hospitals, who care for veterans, and the agriculture inspectors, who keep pests out of our food supply, have lost theirs? The answer is obvious, which is that this is political retaliation, masquerading as policy, and the national security justification is pretextual bullshit that insults the intelligence of anyone paying attention. Now here's where it gets even more important, because this House vote that's about to happen represents something bigger than just restoring bargaining rights to federal workers. It represents a test of whether Congress can still function as a check on executive overreach, whether bipartisan coalitions can still form around basic principles, like workers having a voice in their workplace, and whether the Republican Party contains anyone with enough spine to stand up to Trump when he's clearly in the wrong. The bill has garnered bipartisan support from 222 members of Congress, including 7 Republicans, which means this should pass easily if it gets a clean vote. But the fact that it took a discharge petition to force that vote reveals how thoroughly MAGA extremism has captured Republican leadership, and how terrified they are of crossing Trump even when doing so would align with both the law and basic decency. The Senate companion bill has similar dynamics playing out because the companion bill in the Senate, introduced in September, has the support of all Democrats and Senate Lisa Murkowski R. Alaska. But whether it can overcome a filibuster or whether Trump would veto it if it reached his desk are open questions that will determine whether this legislative pushback actually restores workers' rights or just serves as a symbolic gesture that temporarily embarrasses the administration. My money would be on Trump vetoing any bill that overturns his union busting, because he's surrounded himself with anti-labor ideologues who view unions as existential threats to corporate power, and because his entire political project depends on maintaining the fiction that he's fighting for working people, while actually waging war on the institutions that give workers any leverage against capital. Let's zoom out for a second and talk about what this means in the broader context of American labor history, because we're at a genuine inflection point, one of those moments that future historians will point to as either the beginning of a renewed labor movement or the moment when organized labor in America was dealt a blow from which it never recovered. 2025 is shaping to be one of the most consequential years that U.S. workers and their movement have ever faced, and the outcome of this fight will ripple through every workplace in America, because when the federal government, which is supposed to model best practices for employers, becomes the biggest union buster in the country, that sends a signal to every corporation, every state government, every private employer, that attacking unions is not just acceptable, it's patriotic. Trump has already normalized so much that was previously unthinkable, and if he succeeds in permanently gutting federal employee unions, then private sector employers will take that as a green light to intensify their own union, busting campaigns secure in the knowledge that the government agencies that are supposed to enforce labor law will be staffed by people who view unions as the enemy. But here's the thing about labor history, which is that it's full of moments where workers faced seemingly insurmountable odds, where the entire apparatus of state power was arrayed against them, where employers had bought off politicians and judges and police, and yet workers organized anyway, and they won anyway, because solidarity is a force that can overcome even the most determined opposition when people refuse to accept their own subjugation. The air traffic controllers lost their fight against Reagan, but that loss helped galvanize a generation of labor activists who rebuilt the movement on new foundations. The Taft-Hartley Act dealt a serious blow to unions in 1947, but it didn't destroy the labor movement. It forced unions to adapt and find new strategies, and right now, in 2025, we're seeing the beginning of what could be another great upheaval, where workers across industries are realizing that the old rules no longer apply, and that the only path forward is to organize, fight back, and refuse to let billionaires and their political puppets steal what previous generations of workers died to win. The connection to Project 2025 cannot be overstated, because every single action this administration takes against workers is ripped straight from that authoritarian playbook, which calls for eliminating public sector unions and creating company-controlled unions in the private sector, and ending exclusive representation for existing unions, and treating foundational labor laws like the Fair Labor Standards Act as negotiable defaults rather than minimum protections, and basically dismantling everything that gives workers any power whatsoever in their relationship with employers. In just 2 months, they have completed 1/3 of the 900-page Project 2025 agenda, which means we're only seeing the beginning of this assault. And if Trump gets a second term, or if Republicans maintain control of Congress, the next wave will be even more devastating, because they'll move from attacking federal unions to gutting the National Labor Relations Act, to repealing prevailing wage laws, to eliminating occupational safety regulations, to rolling back child labor protections, and every other guardrail that prevents America from becoming a Dickensian hellscape, where workers have no rights, capital has no obligations, and the very concept of workplace justice becomes a quaint relic of a bygone era. This is why the discharge petition matters so much, because it demonstrates that resistance is possible, that organized pressure can overcome institutional obstacles, that even in a political environment as toxic as ours, there are still mechanisms for holding power accountable and forcing votes that leadership wants to avoid. The labor movement understood that they couldn't rely on Republican leadership to do the right thing, so they organized, they built coalitions, 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 pressured vulnerable Republicans in swing districts. They activated their members to flood congressional offices with calls and emails. They partnered with Democrats to use procedural tools most Americans have never heard of, and they forced this vote to happen, and that kind of strategic, sophisticated organizing is exactly what's going to be necessary to beat back this authoritarian surge, because Trump and his allies aren't going to stop unless we make them stop, and making them stop requires building power, challenging their legitimacy, tying them up in courts, flooding the streets with protest, and using every lever of democracy that still functions to throw sand in the gears of their agenda. The human stories behind the statistics are what should keep us up at night, because we're talking about nurses who care for veterans being stripped of their ability to advocate for safe staffing ratios. We're talking about food safety inspectors losing the right to report management pressure to prove contaminated products. We're talking about EPA scientists being silenced when they try to warn about environmental hazards. We're talking about workers across dozens of agencies who went into public service because they believed in serving their country, now being told that their patriotism, their expertise, their dedication means nothing compared to their willingness to obey whatever illegal order Trump issues. The government is losing chemists, toxicologists, engineers, and others who ensure drugs and medical devices are safe and effective, and food ingredients aren't poisonous. And when those people leave, they take with them not just their technical skills but their commitment to the public interest, and they're replaced by people whose primary qualification is political loyalty, and whose primary function is to dismantle the very agencies they're supposed to run. What makes this moment so dangerous is that it's not happening in isolation. It's part of a coordinated assault on every institution that could constrain authoritarian power, and we're seeing it play out across multiple fronts simultaneously. Because while Trump is busting federal unions, he's also purging the civil service based on political loyalty tests. He's firing inspectors general, who are supposed to provide independent oversight. He's weaponizing the Justice Department against his political enemies. He's attacking the free press. He's undermining the independence of the judiciary. He's threatening to invoke the Insurrection Act, to deploy military forces domestically, and he's doing all of this while his allies in Congress either cheer him on or maintain a cowardly silence broken only occasionally by mild expressions of concern that never translate into actual opposition. The fact that it took a discharge petition to force this vote tells you everything about where the Republican Party is right now, because there are 7 Republicans co-sponsoring this bill. There are obviously many more who understand that stripping 1 million workers of their bargaining rights is wrong, and yet Republican leadership was so terrified of Trump's reaction that they refused to bring it to the floor for a vote. And that kind of institutional cowardice is how democracies die, because when elected representatives are more afraid of their own party's authoritarian faction than they are of betraying their oaths of office, then you no longer have a functioning system of checks and balances. You have a protection racket where leaders shield a corrupt executive from accountability in exchange for maintaining their own power. And we need to be clear-eyed about what happens next. Because even if this bill passes the House, even if it somehow overcomes a Senate filibuster, even if Trump vetoes it and Congress overrides that veto, which would require a 2/3 majority in both chambers, the Trump administration has already demonstrated that it will simply ignore laws, doesn't like and continue implementing its agenda until courts physically stop it, and maybe not even then. The damage that's already been done is immense. Agencies have terminated contracts, workers have lost protections, people have quit in disgust and despair, and even if those contracts are eventually restored, even if courts rule that the terminations were illegal, the Trump administration will have succeeded in its goal of creating chaos, demoralizing the federal workforce, and demonstrating to anyone who might resist that opposing Trump carries enormous personal and professional costs. But here's what should give us hope, what should fuel our resistance, what should drive us to fight harder than we've ever fought before, which is that workers are organizing anyway, unions are fighting back anyway, courts are ruling against the administration anyway, and a bipartisan majority in the House is about to vote to overturn Trump's illegal executive order anyway, because there are still enough people in this country who understand that democracy without worker power is just plutocracy with extra steps, and that if we allow Trump to succeed in destroying federal employee unions, then every other union in America becomes vulnerable, and once organized labor is gone, there's no institution left with the power and resources to resist corporate domination of every aspect of our lives. This vote is about more than collective bargaining rights. It's about whether we're going to allow billionaires and their political servants to complete their project of dismantling the New Deal, the Great Society, and every other achievement of the American labor movement, or whether we're going to stand up and say that workers built this country, workers keep this country running, and workers deserve a voice in the decisions that affect their lives, their families, and their futures. The parliamentary procedure you just watched might seem arcane, might seem boring, might seem like insider baseball that doesn't matter to regular people, but what it actually represents is democracy in action. Imperfect, messy, procedural democracy, where people who built power through organizing were able to force their representatives to take a vote that leadership desperately wanted to avoid, and that's the blueprint for how we fight back against authoritarianism, because we can't rely on institutions to save us. We have to save institutions by activating them, by using them, by forcing them to function the way they're supposed to function, and by building enough grassroots pressure that even politicians who would prefer to hide from difficult votes have no choice but to go on the record. The labor movement fought back against the largest act of union busting in American history by doing what we do best, organize. And that's what this moment demands from all of us. Whether you're in a union or not, whether you're a federal employee or not, whether you work in the public sector or the private sector, because an injury to one is an injury to all. And when Trump strips bargaining rights from 1 million federal
workers, he's coming for all of us, eventually, and the only way to stop him is to build the kind of solidarity, the kind of cross-sector, cross-industry, cross-demographic coalition that can match his authoritarian ambitions with democratic resistance that cannot be ignored, cannot be suppressed, and cannot be defeated. This vote is just the beginning. This discharge petition is just one battle in a much longer war, but it proves that resistance is possible, that organizing works, that building power matters, and that even in the darkest moments of democratic backsliding, there are still people willing to fight for the principle that workers have rights, governments have obligations, and no president, no matter how authoritarian his ambitions, has the power to strip away freedoms that belong to the people, not to him.